Why we're here is to invite our 2020 SWS Distinguished Feminist Lecturer Award, Katie Acosta, to the stage to provide her keynote lecture. Katie Acosta is Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology at Georgia State University. Give it up for Katie.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here. What I'm sharing today stems from my work in community activism in Atlanta with Central American and Mexican asylum seekers who have recently been released from ICE detention. Shortly after the 2016 election, I started supporting asylum seekers who were traveling by bus across states to their sponsors. After doing this work for a year, I decided that I wanted to document some of the observations that I was witnessing. And I started to write in a way that integrated Gloria Anzaldua's theory of spiritual activism with my own community work. Drawing on field notes from this work, today I want to map out for you the ways that I've integrated Anzaldua's stages of Conocimiento onto my community work in the hopes of walking you through how I've developed my identity as a scholar activist. So first I want to revisit Anzaldua's contributions. And now let us shift. Before her death, Anzaldua began developing a theory of spiritual activism. Ana Louise Keating and others have since risen to the task of building spiritual activism into a more fully developed theoretical framework for scholars to adopt in their writings. But in the earliest versions, Anzaldua notes that individuals' growth, their own ability to grow is through self-reflection and personal inventory, and that that's essential to promote transformative change. Spiritual activism is a powerful form of praxis because it serves as a bridge between one's sense of self and one's material world. Spiritual activism requires one to remain committed to anti-colonial thinking, to remain open to worlds outside of the material one within which we live. And one must use the spiritual connection to build conocimiento and to allow that knowledge to fuel the activism. This praxis, Anzaldua argues, allows one's activist efforts to be transformative. So here we have the stages of conocimiento. The first, el arrebato. It's the violent attack. Your sense of security has been brought into question and you are scared. The second, nepantla. You are living between cultures. You are adrift in a liminal space. And then you reach the third, a dark place. You are in the pit of your grief. Anzaldua describes it as curling up in this fetal position. And then you reach your turning point when you move toward discomfort and embrace a change. Something in you must die in order for something else to be born. In the fifth stage, you are doing the work of forming a new sense of self. You use remnants of the old self to develop a new personal myth. And then comes the blow up. In doing that work, you are caught in the middle of a power struggle. You are in conflict with other marginalized people. One sentence here from Anzaldua that's used in this section to describe this particular stage has always stuck with me. She wrote, "Buying into victimhood forces you and them to compete for the coveted prize of the walking wounded." I revisit this one often. In the last stage, Anzaldua leaves us with hope. Here, Nepantlera's find common ground. Conocimiento helps you move past your pain and move toward the table. and you learn to adopt spiritual activism. I go over the stages of Conocimiento with you because I want to be able to walk you through my process towards scholar activism. And to do that, I need to take you back to 2016, because the 2016 election was my arrebato. Trump had been elected into office, and the vitriol against quote unquote illegals had grown to levels that many could never have imagined. And it was during this time that we saw ICE agents begin separating families seeking asylum. They began putting children in cages. We saw an increase in the ICE raids during these years. I'm reminded that on August 7th, 2019, ICE conducted the largest raid in one state that this country had ever seen. Almost 700 people were arrested in Mississippi on that day. And when school let out, hundreds of children across multiple elementary schools had no one to pick them up. All of their parents had been arrested. US citizens watched the reports of this stuff in horror, no longer recognizing their own country's morals. At the center of this controversy have been the individual actors, the migrants who resist their dehumanization and their criminalization by presenting a counter narrative of themselves as family members. We've seen a shift toward presenting migrants as family members and victims, while simultaneously combating the images of them as rapists, as criminals, as drug dealers, and as gang members. I moved through the first few stages of Conocimiento during this time period. So back to my community work. So since I'm showing you my first image here, I want to make clear that the images that I show in this presentation today were not taken by me. All of these images are images that are publicly available on the internet, taken by journalists and that appear in newspapers. I've selected a few because they most closely resemble the scenes that I'm going to describe, but I did not take them. After my arrebato, I moved seamlessly into Nepantala. And in this liminal space, I sat, where I was an academic. I was expected to conduct research, mentor students, engage in service, but where I, as a person, needed to be in community for my own individual healing. Moving through the first three stages of Conocimiento, from Nepantala to the dark spaces, I arrived at a turning point. It was time to dust myself off and move towards change. And so this community work was born. A grassroots group of volunteers in Atlanta started showing up at transit bus stations to meet asylum seekers. I would travel twice a week to a station in downtown Atlanta to meet asylees that were coming from McAllen, Texas. Most of the families I met had small children. They were headed north to DC, to Maryland, to Virginia, many of them going to New York. The task was very simple. Translate for them, help them get to their connecting buses, offer them food, offer them water. Some wanted to know what city they were in, where they could catch the next bus, how many more times would they have to transfer buses before they would arrive at their final destination. Some asked me to call their sponsors on my phone to update their loved ones about their progress. Some asked that I explain the confusing rules at the bus station. How will the latest delay in buses affect their arrival time? Their questions were endless, but so were their physical needs. The travelers were exhausted. They were thirsty. Some of the children were dehydrated as they had been struck with motion sickness along the way. They needed clean clothes, shoes, diapers, feminine hygiene products. But in the years that I volunteered to help asylum seekers at the bus station, more than anything else, what I found is that they really needed a friendly face, someone that they could trust, one who will not try to admonish them or criminalize them for seeking asylum in the United States. Since these migrants have come from McAllen, they are released first to a charity organization, usually, where they get clean clothes, where they get help purchasing bus tickets or plane tickets if that's what they need. In Atlanta, we've estimated that approximately 60% of the traffic that's released in this way ends up at the downtown station in Atlanta on their journey. And through social media, text messages, WhatsApp, and the like, volunteers at each stop from Texas to Atlanta communicate with one another to let people at the next stop know how many people to expect. At least that's how it goes when it works well, when things happen seamlessly. In Atlanta, we had a unique situation because the migrants would be arriving at a bus station in an area with one of the largest unhoused populations in the city. On the same public sidewalk where I awaited buses lived mostly African-American unhoused men who called those streets home. Atlanta has been particularly cruel to its unhoused population, I would argue anyway. We closed our largest city shelters, and we have city ordinances in place that prevent people from setting up food stations to feed the unhoused. One of the results has been that many unhoused individuals have set up tents and sleeping bags very close to the bus station. And so we share this space. So you may be wondering about this image on this slide. When asylum seekers board buses in McAllen, volunteers there will give them a folder that looks like, volunteers there will give them a folder that looks a lot like this one. Please help me, I don't speak English. The folders contain their bus tickets and their sponsors' phone numbers, any of their important documentation. When I would meet people in Atlanta, I would carry this one. Si no muestras tu sobre marrón, te podemos ayudar. I would stand outside holding a folder similar to this one over my head. And as migrants got off the buses and their folders met my folder, I would break the awkward silence. I would introduce myself. I would let them know that I was there to help. There's a lot that I can say about this work, but I want to focus on just a couple of things. The first is the issue of agents of social control and of parallel transients. It's not uncommon for me to observe ICE officials standing outside of bus terminals, awaiting to board the newly arrived buses to ask passengers for their documentation at random. Because the passengers are all newly released from ICE, the random checks that they experienced between the border and their final destination city is all occurring within days of their release. The migrants often arrive in Atlanta with ankle bracelets, similar to those that are worn by newly released prison inmates who are on parole. These efforts weave a web of surveillance for which asylum seekers are constantly subject. It's not uncommon for me on any given night at the station to see the Atlanta Police Department officers and ICE agents standing side by side at the terminal awaiting passengers. The latter distinguishable only by the black vest that they wear with ICE written in bold white letters. Presumably, the Atlanta Police Department is only present to manage the everyday street crime that's occurring in the area. But it's unclear nonetheless in these scenarios where one's authority ends and where the other's authority begins. Still, the distinction is an important one because one of these agents of social control has the ability to deport the asylum seekers and the other one does not. Because I met these families outside, I would regularly interact with the unhoused homeless population. I observed how this homeless population was treated by transit officials and by Atlanta police. And then I started to juxtapose this with the treatment of mostly Central American and Mexican asylum seekers in this exact same space. Once, while outside, I noticed APD restraining an African-American unhoused man with a cognitive impairment. The homeless man was scared. He slurred his words, and he had a difficult time holding up his own body. He kept asking APD to leave him alone, but the police kept insisting that he get on the ground in the middle of the street. He didn't seem to understand this request, and APD was getting frustrated. They pushed the man onto the floor and left him with his cheek kissing the street. One officer had a knee on the man's back. The man cried, "Leave me alone." Upset, a fellow volunteer working with me that night yelled at the officers. "Leave him alone," she said. "He isn't bothering anybody." "Shut the fuck up, lady," the police officer said. "Mind your own business." "This is my business," the volunteer screamed back. "Do you have a permit for that food station?" the officer asked. Hearing this, I ran over and I grabbed the volunteer. "We aren't selling anything," I said to the officer, hoping to de-escalate the situation. "Do you have a permit for that table?" the officer asked me. I looked down at the street. "Okay then," he said. "Mind your business." This interaction bothered me for the remainder of the evening. As a volunteer, my purpose there was to help asylum seekers, but that night, this unhoused man needed my help, anybody's help. I personally felt powerless to do anything about it, in part because technically speaking, I didn't have a right to set up a distribution table at that corner. Thanks to Atlanta's city ordinance not allowing us to have tables to feed the homeless. Every time we went out there, we were clear that we risked getting fined. But we also knew that if we didn't draw attention to ourselves, that no one would bother us. But on this night, advocating for the man whose cheek was on the street put everything at risk, put us at risk of shutting down the volunteer work. Standing outside with the table, awaiting the buses, also gave me an opportunity to watch how the asylees responded to the unhoused population and vice versa. And this got me thinking a lot about racial tensions and interethnic conflict. Since the operations happened outside, the requests from the unhoused for our supplies happened all the time. But we often did not know how many migrants would be coming off of any given bus. So we never knew if we had enough supplies for the migrants. And we never knew if we had enough supplies to share. But we knew on any given day that there was more than enough need. That we always knew, and that we would try to plan for. But we were constantly struggling between bringing what we needed to the station, but not having so much at the station that we wouldn't be able to very quickly shut down the whole thing and leave if someone came to ask questions. It was a fine line between bringing enough, but not bringing too much. We would have to calculate how many water bottles we needed. How many can we give out before the buses arrives? This practice created a lot of tension and arguments among volunteers, and it was something we never fully resolved. One night, I wrote the following notes when my shift ended, and I was at home alone. I'm just going to read it for you. We had a lot of requests from homeless people today, which continues to be hard. One man expressed his particular unhappiness with me because, in his words, as a Black person, I should want to help him. I have a lot of thoughts on this issue, most too complicated to articulate here. What I will say is that I think our efforts may be contributed to the unintended effect of worsening race relations between marginalized groups. I wrote this after a particularly difficult night when, despite our best efforts, we did run out of supplies. Concerned about racial tensions, I explained to a lot of homeless folks who the asylum seekers are and why we had been sent there to help them. Most of these folks had no idea what asylum was, nor why we were experiencing an influx of these migrants now as opposed to at any other given time. But regardless, the interactions revealed their resentment, which stems from feelings that their needs are being neglected while those of asylum seekers are being met. Part of what I'm doing with this work is drawing the parallels between these two communities, who are both criminalized through similar agents of social control, but who do not see an affinity with one another. I explore the interethnic conflict that's stemming from resentment in times of sparse resources, but I also explore how this conflict stems from larger systems of racialized oppression that pit one racially minoritized group against another, both trying to claim their stake as more deserving based on the same racist and gendered logic that's used to oppress them in the first place. I'm reminded here of Ansaldúa. Buying into victimhood forces you and them to compete for the coveted prize of the walking wounded. The next theme that I want to talk about is presenting as family. So US immigration policies have evolved from a system of family unification to one that criminalizes migrants and places them in opposition to hardworking, quote unquote, American citizens. The racialized undertones evoked in the political framing of migrants as nefarious individuals as opposed to as family members. not only divide people into good and bad individuals, but also into worthy individuals and non-citizens. At the center of this controversy are the individual people, many of whom I met on those streets in Atlanta. I quickly learned that when a two-parent family seeking asylum separates into two individual groups of single parents, they are facilitating their reading by border enforcement as a family and as vulnerable subjects. I noticed this immediately when starting this work because of the number of fathers that I saw doing this as a strategic act to support their not being viewed as terrorists and as criminals or as gang members. One of my earliest observations was of a father that I saw without a partner, but with at least one child. I soon learned this was the strategy. I regularly found myself offering toddlers crayons and keeping them busy, bouncing babies on my hip to give a migrant parent's arms a rest. I will never forget this one father carrying a baby approximately 7 months old. I walked with him to his bus while he carried bags and his folder. I held his baby in my arms. When we got on the bus, I tried to help him find a seat. He walked up and down the aisle looking for a place to put his bag. And he pulls out his folder and he pulls out the identification in the folder. "I lost my wife," he said to me in Spanish. "My parents, my sister, my wife, my 3 kids, we all came walking together." But we got separated. And I haven't been able to find them. He pulled out an identification card from his folder and he showed it to me. "This is me," he said, showing me his ID. "This is who I am." I looked at his documents politely, but I hesitated to read the name. It's always better if I don't know any of their personal information. For as passengers, I need them to come in and come out and be safe, and for me to not have any information that ultimately could be used to put them in jeopardy later. So I did not read his name. It was only later that night when I thought about this, and as I was writing, that I realized that he wanted me to remember his information. He wanted me to remember his information in case I happened to see his wife in the days or the weeks to come. Only later did I realize that he was hoping I might be able to convey to his family that he had crossed, that I had met him in Atlanta, and that he and the baby were almost safe. I'm going to shift here because I obviously cannot do this. So I want to shift here to thinking about my work as a scholar activist. Being a scholar activist has afforded me the opportunity to reflect upon how theory fuels my community work. For me, thank you. For me, being a scholar activist means that my work as an academic involves blending my research activities with my community engagement. They are not separate, but intertwined practices informed by my intersectional feminist paradigms. My community engagement is a space that affords me the opportunity to be surrounded by co-ethnics, to speak Spanish, and to continue my lifelong work of immigrant advocate, work that has been a signature facet of my life and of the lives of many children of immigrants. In this way, my work with asylum seekers tethers me to who I am as a person, separate from the academy and the infinite ways that that academy has tried to define me. My community work with asylum seekers protects me from losing sight of what matters most to me as an Afro-Latina, a feminist scholar, a queer woman, a daughter of immigrants, and all of these identities in no particular order. They are who I am, and those identities are what I do every day as an educator, as a researcher, as a community advocate, day in and day out. I contribute to the creation of nurturing spaces of resistance. Sometimes when I talk about this work with people, they think about what I do for others as if somehow offering someone a bottle of water is a saintly act. I don't see it that way at all. I get far more out of this experience than any small kindness that I can offer on any given day. This is about creating a space of resistance for myself. As someone who is submersed in a very whitewashed academia, it's about hanging on to that space and that version of my identity in an academic world that is constantly trying to redefine me to fit its own mold. And this is where spiritual activism guides me. I turn to it again and again because I think scholars can learn from Ansaldua's theory or spiritual activism as a grounding force in our efforts to produce social justice and anti-racist centered scholarship. Spiritual activism is a powerful form of praxis, and going back to it as a tenured professor who is in a position to take risks, I am able to bridge the academic work that I do with the activist that I am. I see them as connected when at times in earlier iterations of my life, in earlier iterations of my academic life, I wasn't allowed to. Scholars endeavoring to produce anti-racist, social justice-focused scholarship stand to learn a great deal from spiritual activism. It provides us a roadmap for transformative change and what it looks like. It's an activism that's deeply grounded in one's personal journey, one's intimate connections between the material world guide our passions and sustain that activism. And when scholars approach their activism in this way, the bridge of the two become imperative. Ansalduan theory consistently focused on bridges, creating them to connect our worlds, building them to connect us. Scholar activists who choose to advance this scholarship must challenge the bifurcation of their fundamental aspects of our identities in the academy. And we must also demand of ourselves and our students the kind of personal passion that ignites and fuels spiritual activism. It is an injustice to our social causes for these aspects of our identities to remain separate. Ultimately, our abilities to advance knowledge requires that we connect with the personal. That's what brings us all to the activism in the first place. I know you all know that. As feminist theory has often taught us, right? That passion is what fuels our activism, and that is the knowledge. So I want to stop here today. I want to thank you all for being here and for listening to me. And I would love to hear any comments or questions that you have. Thank you.
Katie, muchísimas gracias.
Gracias a ti, hermana.
Thank you so much, Katie, because not only because what you just shared with us in terms of the process of being involved in this scholarship, in this activism, but I think for me, at least, is to see how you put yourself here, to fragilidad, right? And something that we, the people that we are involved, you know, many of us as feminists, working in along with communities that are marginalized, and in many times communities that we belong to, is very difficult. And I felt your pain, I felt your struggle, because also it's always that second voice inside of us is, you know, like what it means to be with people in the community, learning from the community. And I really appreciate what you said, that by being there, you were learning more than the people were getting from that bottle of water, right? So I think it's difficult, but I think that's very important, how to bring that experience in that particular way that you are doing it, the way that you are doing it, showing us your fragility, showing us the struggles, the contradictions. And in that sense, thank you so much, because it's also helping us to push us, you know, like to continue and do that work, but also how we can create those spaces, you know, because sometimes it's so, we have been talking about this a lot, the emotional labor, but I think in the long run it's becoming very accumulative. And something that we talk about in the plenary this morning is, you know, the constant crisis. And those communities are, and we also, because we are part of those communities in very different level, obviously are privileged. But how we can create spaces for that kind of work, not only be yourself there, but with others. So how we can create esa comunidad entre nosotras y aquí en ese espacio. Gracias, Katie.
Thank you. You know, it's weird, like when I started doing this work, we've talked a lot about trauma this weekend. And I think that the pandemic actually put me in a place where I actually took the time to think through how trauma works, to understand it as something more than just what I'm feeling, but to understand it as like our body's physiological responses to pain. And having that information now, I can look back on 2016 and on my first year doing this community work, and I can realize that I was in action mode, right? I was not letting myself feel, I was putting myself out there because something needed to be done, and it was a lot easier to move and to work and to offer water bottles than it was to feel it, right? And so I did that. And then I think the more you do it, then the heavier it gets. And then it's like, well, where do I put all of this? You know, and I actually have to give a lot of credit to this community, because my feminist mentors were the first to say, Katie, you need to write. You need to write about this. And I said, no, this isn't an academic project. I'm volunteering, right? You know. And they said, yeah, but you need to write. You need to have some place to put it. Get a journal. And so then for a minute, I was like, I'll write some field notes, and then I'll have separate place to process my emotional stuff, right? Because I was still thinking like the academic that I was trained to be. And then at some point, and I really don't know where, it was just kind of like, no, these two things are not separate. These two things are one, right? Like what I'm seeing and how I'm feeling it is influencing everything that I do. Like it's what I come back to the office with and the ivory tower for. Like that bifurcation became something that I didn't really have a choice but to figure out how to weave together just to keep going. So, I mean, I'd like to see us be able to do more within the academy to challenge the separation of these two things. Because I think in my own personal experience, it left me in a place where I was like, well, when am I going to find the time to go to the bus station? I'll meet the 7:30 bus in the morning, and then I'll go into the office, and then I'll work, as if somehow that made sense to think about it as like something I did on the side, as opposed to something I did because of who I am. But that's how the academy sets things up for us, right? That's how we write, that's how we publish, like processing our emotional experience with what goes on in the world is seen as not something scholarly. And so I really needed to get myself to a place where I was just willing to take that risk and where I just no longer cared, you know, like I just don't care anymore. Like if it's seen as scholarly work, then it is. And if it isn't, then I'm still doing it. And then that's where like you give yourself permission for that. And then to demand that of each other. And I think that that's like where that's the place that I'm trying to focus on being more at this point, to a place where we can support one another's efforts in doing this. The panel that we just had just before this one, where Ventura said we need to spend 50% of our times on the street, and then we need to go back to the academy and make sure they recognize that that's work. Like that speaks to me in a very specific way, right? Like, I don't know what it looks like to get from here to there, but I know that that's what's missing. And that when it's missing, that is a form of violence in and of itself. That's forcing me to like fragment myself in a way that is not necessary. And that is only doing to make white people feel comfortable in the academy.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you, Veronica. And I just kind of wanted to go on what you're saying, because I think it really is an act of resistance to tap into our human emotions. Because I think that's part of dismantling the power structures too, because, you know, I've been really thinking about this from my personal perspective, living on the border, right, where there were kids in cages and tents, and we've got I live in El Paso, Texas, and there was a lot going on with ICE, and the majority of Border Patrol in El Paso they're Hispanic, they're Mexican, they're first or second generation or third generation, right? The largest major that we have at UT El Paso is criminal justice, because those are the people, they want a job in Border Patrol, and they are Latinos. And I think about it, your talk really made me think about, are they tapping into their emotions? I can't see how, right? There's got to be that disconnect. But what would happen if they did, right? Like, is it our job, as you're saying, you're talking about it within the academy of dismantling the power structures, but it makes me think about this larger racist, capitalist, colonial structure too, that needs to take the lead of tapping into our human emotions. And I wondered if you wanted to talk about that.
I appreciate that. Thank you. There comes a point where it's like, you need people not to feel in order for them to continue to get up every day and do these kinds of things that hurt their souls, right? And even if you can't relate to any of these conversations about the border and asylum, think about what we've all experienced over the past 2 years in the academy, right? Think about those of us, all of us, who were asked, as many workers were, to put our lives on the line and to go inside our classrooms and to teach our students, right? If you live in the state of Georgia, you did so without a mask mandate, without a vaccine mandate, and without a testing mandate. They asked us to risk our lives, right? They just did it. They need us not to feel it, though, right? That's how you keep going. If you stop and you think about it and you see how incredibly fucked up it is, right? Then like you can't keep processing. And I think that I've gotten to a point, and I think I owe the trauma of the past 2 years, you know, as the silver lining of that for me is that I've gotten to the point where I realize that life is short. You know, when you bury your loved ones, you realize that life is short and that we have to demand of each other to be fully present, and that we have to demand of each other to remember that, you know, we have the gift of being here, that, you know, the fact that COVID did not affect us the way that it did others means that we have an obligation, right, to stay here and continue to make it count. And I think it's that kind of fully present mindset that I'm asking of all of my students and of all of my colleagues, and that I want to try to remind everyone to continue to stay accountable to, because, you know, we could let this neoliberalism continue to eat at our souls, or we could find ways to stay grounded for ourselves so that we don't get lost in it. When I think about Mexican border agents who kind of make this argument that, you know, my ancestors or my grandparents came to this country and they waited their turn and they did so legally, the only thing I can think of in my brain to rationalize that logic is that they've compartmentalized their jobs from their emotions and what they feel about it. They're not letting themselves feel anything about it. And that's only feeding into this larger structure, right? That's continuing to pit the rest of us against each other. So I'm going to ask that of all of you, right, as my community, and I hope that you all will remember to ask it of me, right? Fully present. Right? Even if we don't have a choice, but to do the things that we need to do in order to keep moving in this society. I want us to feel it even though it hurts.
Dr. Acosta, I just wanted to say thank you. And we've talked so much about decolonial epistemologies and sentipensante research. And however, I was disappointed because this was missing. I wish you could feel my heart. It is bumping, and it's been like that throughout the presentation. And I think this is what it's about. And as an early stage scholar, I look up to you. And I am thankful for this space where we are allowed to cry, and we are allowed to pass out tissues and just to hug without it being unprofessional. So thank you very much. And I am not the only one who's in this position to looking up to brighter futures, thanks to this community and to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And yeah, I really appreciate that. I was writing this talk and I practiced it a bunch of times, and I said, how am I going to get through this without crying? And then I said, you know, I'm probably not going to get through this without crying, and it's going to be okay. And I wouldn't take that risk in any other space but this one. So thank you. I could share with you if you. Can I give you a hug?
I'm supposed to function now. Okay. So if there are no other questions or comments, I guess I and I can't really articulate much, but muchas gracias. No, thank you. And so let's just wrap it up.
Thank you all. I guess the only thing I was gonna say was there was more of the presentation I couldn't get through without ugly crying. And I draw the line at ugly crying. For Barbara Rissman, who might be in here at this point right now, reminded me yesterday when I registered that this actually gets published for Gender and Society at some point. So like maybe at some point when I pull myself back together and I finish writing the whole thing, then maybe you all can catch it there. So thanks.